There's an old Zulu proverb. The full-bellied child says to the empty-bellied child, "Be of good cheer." It's a reminder that those of us with privilege sometimes forget that others do not have it. The full-bellied child says to the empty-bellied child, "Be of good cheer." Perhaps Paul had something like this in mind when he was writing that first letter to the church in Corinth, when he says, "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing." Maybe that's what he had in mind. We don't know. That moment, of course, begins a discourse on the nature of human and divine wisdom, but maybe his point was simpler than that. Maybe he was trying to say, whether he intentionally meant it or not, what we have all come to understand, that if we are struggling for life itself, it is hard to hear anything, much less the gospel message. If we're struggling to know where our next meal will come from, if we don't know if we'll have a roof over our head, if every single day we face a world that dismisses us for the way we look or the way we love, it's hard to hear a message of life, especially when it comes from people who don't seem to have to fight for their own. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Maybe those of us who find ourselves with fuller bellies owe it to those who do not to listen to their story before we insist on sharing our own. Because maybe, just maybe, the gospel that we long to proclaim, that light that we long to shine into those dark places, is already there. In other words, friends, maybe the shadow we see this Groundhog Day is our own. In addition to being Groundhog Day and Super Bowl Sunday, today is the beginning of Black History Month. This is the beginning of Black History Month, a month that we've set aside to honor the unique contributions of African American members of our communities throughout the centuries, as if a month were enough. Given that this is our bicentennial year as a church, then it seemed fitting that we utilize this month in which to tell some of those most important stories, in which to share some of the unique contributions of the African American members of this congregation, beginning with our very first one, Samson Wood. According to our history, Samson Wood was both a founding member of Asbury First, or First Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal Church of Rochester. That is, one of the first of those 30 people to meet over in Fitzhugh Street, who incorporated on September 20th, 1820. And the only African American in Rochester at the time. Think for just a moment about what that means, that the only member of the African American community, according to our history at the time, was a member of this congregation. In other words, we were as fully integrated as we possibly could have been in the very beginning of this church. It's enough to swell our pride, to make us want to pat ourselves on the back, to shout hooray at just how progressive and forward-thinking we must have been as a congregation. The only challenge, of course, is that it's not true. At least not fully. To be clear, Samson Wood was African American, and he was a founding member of this congregation. But he was not the only African American in Rochester, not by a long shot. It's the way it works, though, doesn't it? It's those children with the full bellies that grow up to tell the story and too often forget that the empty-bellied children were ever around. We see what we want to see and we tell the stories that we see The challenge, of course, is that we are severely limited in what we see by where we're willing to look. My hope today was to tell Samson Wood's story, to treat him like we've treated other hidden figures over the last couple of years, to try and find out a little bit more about his life, about who he was, about what he's done. I spent hours in the public library working with local historians, doing my very best to uncover his story, but I'm afraid, friends, that I failed. Sure, we found some things. He first shows up in the city directory in the very first one, 1827. And we learned there that he lived, like most African Americans at the time, in the 3rd Ward, a place infamous at the time for poor living conditions, poor sanitation, and inhumane living conditions. We even know his address, 21 North Washington Street, where a parking lot sits today. He's listed as a laborer, perhaps one of those who helped build the city after the Erie Canal was complete and we experienced a boom in the city. He doesn't show back up again until 1738 and then disappears in 1841, at which point his daughter or spouse or mother or someone lives in his house by the name of Miss Sophie Wood. That's it. Like so many people of color in our history, who've darkened the door of our churches, who've come through our town, who've stepped across the face of this world, we have forgotten their story. We don't know. We can't say. And we never will. We're left to stare into those shadows and imagine what life would have been like. Fortunately for us, we can do some of that. Starting with the fact that when this church was founded on September 20th, 1820, most of the African American persons in the area would not have been free. We in the North tend to relegate slavery to the South. If we think about it at all, and let's be honest, we don't like to, we tend to relegate it to the South. We think to ourselves, well, that was a Southern problem that we took care of in the Civil War. We forget that the very city in which we now sit was named for a slave holder. Colonel Nathaniel Rochester made his money through the slave trade. And though over the years we've told an erroneous story that when he moved to this area, he freed these enslaved persons, some even claiming that he moved here in order to free his enslaved persons, it doesn't happen to be true. And maybe it's time to bring that out of the shadows. Nathaniel Rochester may have freed a few of his enslaved persons, but we have records of him renting them out by day, by month, by year, all the way up until July 4th, 1827, when manumission became law in New York. In other words, the people who formed First Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal Church, that is us, would have lived in a world where they had seen slaves on a daily basis, where they would have experienced slavery, maybe even participated in it. The very street on which they were founded, Fitzhugh Street, was named for another slave holder, Colonel William Fitzhugh. But the truth is, even if they didn't participate in it, they undoubtedly benefited from it. The truth is, we have all benefited from slavery. We live in a nation whose wealth was built upon it. That in the nascent years of our country, as we were struggling to compete in the world market, it was the only way that we could compete was on the backs, the torture, the rape, and the forced labor of African Americans. And to this day, every dollar that we spend has at least a little blood on it. But even if those persons weren't directly involved in slavery, that is, even if the African Americans living in Rochester at the time were free, they would have still faced obstacles that their white counterparts never would have had to. From fighting for education to basic human living conditions to access to services, frankly, not enough has changed on that front. This was a progressive city, and we have always been a progressive church. But try as we might, as we look back through the annals of fighting for civil rights in those earliest of years, it is not our church's name that you see standing up for those calls for justice. Too often we left it to those historically black congregations to fight for justice on their own. Yes, Samson Wood was a founding member of this congregation. We ought to be proud of that, but we have forgotten his and so many other stories. We do this as a city too. We lift up those big stories, those exceptions to the rules. We lift up Austin Stewart and Frederick Douglass, and forget the countless others who remain hidden behind the scenes. And we forget the struggles that even they, in their positions of power, experienced. In his autobiography, Frederick Douglass tells the haunting tale of deciding to make sure that his daughter didn't go to a segregated school. So he decided to enroll her at Seward Seminary for young women on Alexander Street. And after a few weeks of her growing increasingly quiet, one morning as he was ready to take her to school, she refused. She didn't want to go. When he asked her why, she said simply, "They put me in a closet all day." For weeks, maybe months, she had been sitting in a room without windows by herself so that she didn't mix with the white kids. If Frederick Douglass and his daughter experienced that, what must life have been like for Samson Wood or Sophie Wood or countless others? We cannot change our past, but we can learn from it. We can shine a light into those dark places in the world, and where we are blocking the light, we can step out of the way. We can look back over the successes, yes, but also the failures of the last 200 years, and then turn towards the next 200 years to make sure they don't happen again. And it starts right now. At the end of this month, February 26th, we will be holding a joint Ash Wednesday service with our historically black Methodist congregations within this region. It's a service of repentance and reconciliation, and then for the month ahead, we will be sharing in a devotional booklet with contributions from members of every one of those churches, and then getting together 4 times in each of the congregations so that we might hear each other's stories, so that we might learn a little bit more about each other, so that we don't become the full-bellied child saying to the empty-bellied child, "Be of good cheer." Friends, the promise of the gospel is that there is a light that shines in the darkness that no darkness can overwhelm, but sometimes we have to get out of the way in order to see it. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God.